Just as I did before, I pull my opponent onto me. In order for this submission to work, you want your opponent's body lying on top of you. If he falls to his side, then your leg will be trapped to the mat, making it impossible to move your leg around his head. So, you always want to keep your leg free when executing the submission. If you are doing this submission to the opposite side, then you want to keep your opposite leg free. If he rolls to that side, then your leg will be trapped. As long as you keep that leg free, you can throw it over his head and finish the armbar. So I have pulled my opponent on top of me. I attempt to finish him with a rear naked choke, but he defends against the submission. So I switch to the armbar. One more time. I attack my opponent's neck with the choke. He defends, so I release the arm I have wrapped around his neck, move it to the opposite side of his head, and grab his wrist. Notice how once I grab his left wrist with my right hand, I grab my right wrist with my left hand. This is a figure 4 grip, and it allows you to maintain control of your opponent's arm while you throw your leg over his head.
Mais rápido.
Now I demonstrate how to submit your opponent with katagatame from the back position when he is defending against the rear naked choke. Having secured an underhook with my right arm and an overhook with my left arm, I pull my opponent onto me. With his hands tied up defending the rear naked choke, I hook my left leg underneath his left leg and apply pressure to remove his post. This redistributes his weight, which will make it easier for me to slip out from underneath him. Next, I slide my right arm across his neck, drop my left elbow down to the mat, and establish a 10-finger grip. It is important that I tuck my left elbow to my side in order not to hinder my roll. Once accomplished, I force my opponent to my left and roll onto my left side. Notice how I have his right arm trapped between my head and right arm. To defend against the submission, my opponent attempts to turn back into me. If I allow him to do this, he could possibly escape. So I place my right foot in the crook of his left leg, which allows me to prevent him from posting on that foot and rolling into me. Next, I move off to my opponent's side and come up onto my knees. To finish the submission, I drive his right shoulder into the side of his neck by pressing my head against his triceps, and my arms cut into the left side of his neck, severing the blood flow to his brain. He has no choice but to tap out. Now I will spar with my brother from the back position, using the techniques I demonstrated in real speed. Now I will focus on the bottom guard position. When you're lying on your back with an opponent in your guard, you must be very alert. If you have your guard closed, meaning your feet are locked together behind your opponent's back, then you'll be very easy to hit. So most of the time you don't want to stay in closed guard for long. The tendency is to open your guard and place your feet on your opponent's hips. You can have your opponent's arms between your legs or on the outside of your legs. For defense, the most important thing is that your feet on your opponent's hips. If I'm in the closed guard and my opponent punches, I lift my arm to defend against the strike. At the same time, I open my guard and place my left foot on his hip. If my opponent is really big, then I'll place my knee in his chest to further hinder his striking. Notice how when I place my knees on my opponent's chest, I am further away from him, making it harder for him to reach my face with his punches. Now if my opponent removes my leg from his chest, forces it to the mat, and then throws a punch, I will elevate my arm and utilize an outside block. But first, you should always use your legs for defense. Once more, my opponent begins attacking me, and I use my legs for defense. Again, my opponent attacks me, and I use my legs for defense, always protecting myself. Now I demonstrate what to do when your opponent decides to stand up in your guard. Every time he stands up, you need to control his hands. In this situation, I place both of my feet on his hips at the same time, and as he stands up, I use my legs to push his body away from me. If he comes back toward me, then I will kick his knee, move onto my side, and plant my elbow on the mat. To protect my head from kicks, I always keep my opposite hand elevated. Next, I will kick his knee and then come up onto my hand. I will kick his knee one last time and pop back up to the standing position. The opposite points of base on my body are what allow me to swing my hips underneath me effortlessly and assume a standing position while facing my opponent throughout the entire transition. So here, my left foot and right hand. When you have an opponent in your guard, a lot of times you will place his hands on your chest or hook them around the back of your head. In such a situation, I'll wrap my arms over his arms to control them. There are many ways to secure the arms, and it's up to you to discover what feels best. Once I'm controlling his arms, I'll dig my free hand underneath his knee. While still controlling his arms, I will use my hook on his knee to turn my body toward my right side. At the same time, I elevate my right leg over his back and swing my left leg over his head. One more time. My opponent grabs my head, and I establish control over his arms. Next, I dig my hand under his knee, turn toward my right side, and pass my leg over his head. Then I finish the armbar. My opponent grabs my head, and I obtain control of his arm. Next, I slide my hand under his knee, rotate my body, and then throw my leg over his head. When you throw your leg over your opponent's head, it is very important that you do so immediately. You don't want to move your foot up to your opponent's hip and then throw it over his head. You want to move it all the way over his head immediately. One more time. This is a quick move made possible by a mistake from your opponent. If you hesitate on the transition, you will likely lose the submission. In this technique, I attempt to submit my opponent with the armbar, but he pulls his arm free, preventing me from getting the submission. Instead of giving up on my positioning, I immediately switch to an omoplata, which is a shoulder lock. So here my opponent is in my guard, and he grabs my head, just like in the last sequence. I control his arms, dig my hand under his knee, rotate, and throw my leg over his head. However, when I bring my leg over, my opponent pulls his arm out, making it impossible for me to finish the armbar. Instead of giving up, I attack his other arm, which is still inside. To do this, I kick my legs forward, cross my legs to lock his arm, and come up. Notice how I throw my right arm over his back. This will prevent him from rolling. One more time. My opponent holds my head, I control his arm, pass my leg over his head. He gets his arm out, and I go for the omoplata by locking up his arm, kicking forward, and coming up. He grabs, I control his arm, throw my leg over. He pulls his arm free, and I go for the omoplata. Kick my legs to get him to come forward, sit up, and force him to tap. There are many ways to apply a triangle choke on an opponent in your guard. The method I show here is perhaps the most basic.